All right, in this very first lesson, what we're going to be doing is taking a look at 3ds Max's user interface. So what's a user interface? Well, it's basically what the user, that would be you watching the video, is going to be interacting with to tell Max what it is that you want to do.
Wow, man, that was deep.
It's the buttons, it's the sliders, it's everything that you see right now on your screen, as a matter of fact.
All right.
Now, for a beginner, when they first launched 3ds Max, the interface can be extremely stressful looking. Okay?
Very intimidating.
Exactly. And, you know, the idea is to break it down in this lesson so it's not that bad, because it really isn't bad. It's laid out very, what's the word I'm looking for?
Efficiently.
Efficiently. I like that. Okay, so the first thing that's going to pop out at you right away is these large 4 blocks right here. And these are known as viewports. We've got an entire lesson dedicated to viewports coming up next. But right now what I want to do is just simply tell you that these are the windows, if you will, into the world of 3D, or the virtual world that you're going to be creating.
They're what you use to see what's actually in your scene.
Exactly. If you didn't have these, it'd be like working blindfolded. And, well, have you ever tried using a hammer blindfolded?
Yeah, actually.
You have.
Yeah.
I don't even want to know the story.
That hurt.
Okay, so let me go ahead and create something. Even though we do have a lesson that's dedicated to these, just to kind of give you an idea, I have just created a sphere. Okay? Ooh, pretty fancy, eh?
That was.
And with this sphere, we can now see that we've got a perspective view. In this perspective view, we've got this 3D representation. And I can come in here and I can rotate around it, look on top, look up underneath it, etc. We come over here and we've got a left view, a top view, and a side view. And these views are giving us 2D representations of the objects in our scene.
That's an awesome sphere, dude.
Okay, so these are our orthographic views. Okay, it took some time to create that.
Yeah.
Actually, no, it didn't. It was very simple. All right, so moving on from our viewports, which we'll be talking about more in a little while, we'll come up to the top, and as just about everybody that's watching this video already knows, just about every Windows application has got a menu bar.
Right.
And this is our main menu bar across the top. And it's broken up very common sense manner, if you will. Basically, if you're working with files, almost every program's got file as the very first one. A new file, reset, open, save your stuff, etc., etc. And there's some pretty neat things up under here, and you start getting into XREF and merging and importing and exporting, and these are things that we can talk about later on, not right now.
Right.
But the big thing I'd like to point out while we're up underneath the file menu is new and reset. Okay? What new is going to do is allow you to create a new scene, but it's going to leave your viewport in the state that you were currently in. And here's what I mean. Let's say I was to come over here to my perspective view, and I'm going to what's called maximize that view. So now it's kind of full screen almost. And then perhaps come over here to the Modify tab. Now, for those that are completely new, which should be most everyone watching this video, don't panic with the things that I'm doing. We're going to be covering all of this stuff in this VTM. But if I was to take this object right here, and let's go ahead and, well, let's just come over here and convert it to a poly. And there's like all sorts of stuff. And if I wanted to, come up here and say File, New. Of course, it's going to ask if I'd like to save my changes, and let's just say no, because there's nothing fancy going on. And now, New All, I have several different options. Right now, I'm just going to go ahead and go with the default, which is New All. Now, I've got a new scene, but you'll notice that the state that we're in is basically the ending state we were at just a second ago with the scene we were working on. In other words, we have a maximized perspective viewport, and we are still on what is called the Modify command panel.
All modifications that we made to the UI have remained.
Okay, so now if I was to, let's say, go back in here and we had another sphere real quick and we were back over here and pretty much the same way we were a second ago. And I wanted to do a new scene, but at the same time I wanted to kind of revert back to the default way 3ds Max first launched. And this is something that's pretty important to beginners because there's so many different things that you can do inside of Max that a beginner can get to a point where they feel really lost, which
Right.
isn't really good. I mean, that can be quite intimidating if you don't know where you are.
Oh, absolutely.
So if you come up here to File and come down to Reset, of course, again, it's going to ask, would we like to save the incredible work that we've done so far?
That is a great sphere.
Well, thank you. I'll simply tell it no. And then, of course, it's going to come around and say, all right, did you accidentally go up and hit File, then accidentally come down and hit Reset and all this good stuff? Well, no, we really do want to reset this. So we'll answer yes. And look what it did. It has now reset everything back to the way that you'll find Max when it first launches after installing the application.
That's
We've
really cool.
Got our 4 viewports. We're now back over to the Create panel. Everything's ready to rock and roll. Okay?
Very nice.
So definitely an important one to understand. Coming on across, we've got Edit, Tools, Group, Views. I mean, it's just, you know, when you're dealing with objects with selections, etc. You'll come up here to edit. A neat thing to know about edit, everybody, of course, is familiar with save and open.
Oh, I know what you're about to show.
Save scene, open scene, etc. Come over here to edit, hold and fetch. These guys are great. If as you're working, you want to experiment with something, you could just do a quick hold, which is going to basically save your scene to a temporary file, and then you can come back in here and do a quick fetch, and it will retrieve the last thing you held. So a little different than actually saving your scene out. It's just like in a different temporary save, if you will.
Right, you don't have to assign it a name or anything.
And Alt-Control-H and Alt-Control-F, two fantastic sets of hotkeys to remember for doing this. Just again, especially when you're new, while you're experimenting with various things, because you may not want to accidentally mess up your scene.
And the really cool thing about that is it will actually fetch like the next time you use Max if you wanted to.
Yes.
It's very awesome.
So we'll come over here to tools, just a series of different tools mirroring something using the array tool, snapshot, etc. And these are things that we'll be covering throughout this and other VTMs. Group for working with a group of objects, multiple objects at one time. We've got views, we've got create for creating stuff, modifying stuff, various character-related tools, animation tools like IK solvers, constraints, etc. We've got various graphs that we can be working with, and we're going to take a look at a few of these, such as the curve editor, dope sheet, and the schematic view throughout this VTM here. Rendering options. Dealing with customization of the viewports and the layouts itself of 3ds Max, MaxScript, and help. Now, in my case, I've got Human IK at the very end. Human IK is a Kadara plugin that's really, really cool. It brings an application called Motion Builder, a lot of that application, at least all the rigging aspects, to 3ds Max. So most of you out there probably will not have this plugin up there. Don't worry about it. Okay, so let's go ahead now and move on down to this area right here. This is our main toolbar. Main toolbar contains a bunch of icons for things that you're going to be using often, such as undo and redo. These are big ones. I do something, such as create a sphere, create another sphere, and then let's say I select my move tool and move it, and I want to undo that move. I can undo, and I can redo. Simple enough. But one thing that a lot of people don't know is the fact that you can come up here and you can right-click on these icons and get a small pop-up dialog that's going to give you a list of all the things that you've done, and you can go back in time. So you can see the first undo I do will undo that move, then it will undo the create, then the other create. So if I select all of them, say undo, and then it's just going to go ahead and go all the way back so that nothing has been created.
And just a quick note about that, you can't actually use that to undo something like in the middle of the list.
Right.
It's going to back its way up and undo everything that came after that command.
Exactly. And, of course, we get the same list with redo. If I was to right-click on that, I can come back in here and redo all of those commands as well. Okay? So, let's go ahead and move on over. We've got some icons here that are going to deal with linking. And I guess, Zach, this is a really good point for me or a good place for me to point out that I'm not going to cover what every single button does. Just a quick, basic idea of a lot of this stuff, that's all.
Right.
Because, again, we're going to end up in a big mess if we try to get into everything. But, we're dealing with hierarchies here. So
folks are going to want to be able to download this in less than 10 hours.
Yes, agreed. So moving right along. So hierarchies, linking and unlinking, and dealing with binding things to space warps. Selecting. This is an important one. This just allows us to simply come in and select objects. As you can see, I click on the object, it selects it.
Okay.
I can mark key around, it selects both. Moving right along, moving on over, basically we've got a select by name where we can bring up a dialog, and inside this dialog we've got various checkboxes, radio buttons, etc. to help us in making simple or complex selections.
Okay.
Simple enough. And we'll be using this quite a bit. In fact, we'll be using it so much that I'll go ahead and tell you that H is the hotkey to bring it up. Just an easy way when you got 1,000 things in your scene to select something.
Oh, you're preaching to the choir, man. I love hotkeys.
Moving on over, another thing that you may find helpful is some various selection tools to help you out, where you can select what type of selection would you like. In other words, we want to do a rectangular marquee, a circular marquee selection, fence, or even a lasso type. Next to that, we've got basically selection filters where we can go in there and say, look, we want to only be able to select geometry or only shapes, lights, etc. And then we can come in here and go to combos, and we can create various combos. And you can see here I've already got 2 in there. Okay, geometry and shapes, lights and cameras.
Very cool.
Okay, moving right along. We've got our window crossing icon, and this helps control just, how objects are selected. Right now, you can see this little dark circle right here is being bisected by the marquee dotted line right there, meaning that if I was to select and my marquee line goes through it, it will still actually select the object. If I was to click that, you'll now see that the dark circle is in the center, meaning that it needs to be, if I only go over part of it, it will not select the object. I need to actually go all the way over it to select.
Very cool. I like that.
Okay, we'll be getting into the manipulators a little bit later. These guys are really important. We've got a lesson for them coming up a little bit later on. But this is if you want to come in here and simply relocate your object around by moving it, by perhaps rotating it, or even by coming in and scaling as well. So we can just come in here and just scale the guy up, scale him down.
Ooh.
Okay. Next to that, we've got another series of commands called the Transform Managers. Transform Managers basically allow you to set up various ways the Transform tools are going to work. We've got the reference coordinate system, which we'll be talking about a little bit later, and we've also got the Transform Center based on, where is the transform that we are performing going to affect the object at? Is it going to work with multiple objects at a center point of all of them, or individual center points of each object, etc.?
Okay.
From there, we get over into a series of snapping tools. We're going to snap to the grid. We're going to snap to whatever. We've also got rotational snapping, but we'll come back to snapping a little bit later.
Okay.
Keyboard shortcut override toggle. This is so that basically we can go in there and we can assign a whole slew of hotkeys, and then we turn that on. We can override all those hotkeys with a whole new slew of new things, if you will.
Very nice.
So now instead of just having 1 million hotkey combinations, you can have 2 million hotkey combinations.
Wow, man, my fingers are cramping just thinking about that.
Over next to that, we've got our selection list or selection sets. This is where we can go in there and we can create selection sets so that we can quickly go back and pull these selections back up. And we'll be talking about these a little bit later. And now we're starting to run out of space. Depending on the resolution that you're running 3ds Max at, you may be able to see your entire main toolbar, or you may have to take advantage of the nice fact that if you move your mouse anywhere over a spot where there's not a button, because of course if there's a button it's going to become raised so that you can click it.
You're going to click the button.
Now I can use this little hand and I can drag the hand back and forth.
That is very cool. And actually you'll find that many of the menus inside of 3ds Max work that way.
That's right. So, and I'll point that out a little bit later as we're cruising through. So getting on over, we've got a few more things in here where we can do some mirroring, some aligning, and then we get into two very popular dialogues that just about everybody's going to be using. Our curve editor, which used to be more known as the track view previously, or previous versions of 3ds Max. We've got the schematic view, and we've got the material editor. So basically working with animation, visually looking at a representation of our scene, working with blocks if you want to, and the material editor where you're going to go in and actually create the materials, or better yet, the paint that you're going to be applying to your objects.
Okay.
Moving right along over, we end up with this final area which deals with rendering. So when we actually perform a render of our scene, what is the render going to look like? So we've got the render scene, which brings up the render scene dialog where we can set about 1 million different settings. Basically, we're going to render a single frame, an animation, what options are we going to have, just it goes on and on and on, but in the end we hit render and boom, there's a render of our actual scene. This is where we go in there and the computer actually calculates all of the lighting, all of the shadows, all the specularity and the way the material interacts with the light, etc., and gives us our final beautiful render.
And that is a beautiful render.
Of course, our viewport just gives us a visual representation, and in the render itself, in this dialog here, which is known as the virtual frame buffer, this is the real deal. This back here, oh, that's just a representation.
Right.
And then, of course, over here, we've also got quick render, which just, boom, it's, kind of goes around the whole render scene dialog, because odds are you're not going to be changing, like, resolution, etc., every single test render you do.
It renders quickly.
Yes.
Hence the name.
Yes. So moving right along over here on the right-hand side, what you have is what is known as the command panel, which is broke up into 6 different panels. These panels are Create, we've got Modify, Hierarchy, Motion, Display, and Utilities. Watch how efficient this is. Watch how smart this is. First one, Create. You want to build something?
Yes.
Everything you can build is right up under here.
Very
you want
cool.
to build standard primitives or anything related to geometry, basically up underneath it. You've got a whole bunch of different things that you can create. So moving over from geometry, if you want to make shapes, circles, lines, etc. You want to create lights. You want to create cameras, helpers. You want to create space warps or systems dealing with things such as bones, sunlight, etc. What's nice about all of these is everything's categorized. So you just saw a slew of categorizations right there. We step down further, And then these are subcategories found up underneath that, such as with shapes. If I come over here, we've got splines or NURBS curves. Depends on the type of shapes you'd like to create. And these are things we'll be digging through later on.
Very cool.
So moving right over, modify. You've got objects that you've created. Now you want to go in there and start modifying these objects. This is where you'll perform your modifications. We do have something on the modifier stack coming up a little bit later in this VTM.
Cool.
Moving right along, we've got hierarchy. And we start dealing with hierarchy is basically where you take objects and you start parenting them together. You start working with IK. There's all sorts of things that you can find under here. Also, if you want to move pivot points of an object, all of these things will be found under here. And this, again, is just something we'll get to as time goes on. For dealing with motion, it's all about animation.
Right.
So you're working with animation, you'll be working up under here. The big thing is, this is one of many places where you can go in and start assigning controllers. We'll be talking about controllers later, a little later as well. Display, well, you want to make something visible. You want to hide something. You want to freeze something so that you can see it, but yet not select it. You want to change the color of wireframe or the shaded mode. You want to hide things by categories, etc. Everything dealing with display you can find from the display panel. And then finally, there's so many cool things that just don't simply fit up under any of these other panels, and they're just little utilities. So what Discrete has done is they've put a utility panel in here, and the utility panel contains just that. A bunch of utilities. In fact, if we click the More button, you'll see that is a whole bunch of utilities that you can use that help you out with your scene.
Every random thing that wouldn't fit inside of another category.
You got it. All right, so moving right along, coming down here to the bottom, we've got some groups of buttons and icons that I want to talk about. This first group right here is known as the viewport navigation controls, and we'll be talking about them more in depth in the next lesson. But real quickly, it's just for, navigating around your viewports. Simple enough.
Cool.
Okay. Moving right along, we've got our animation playback controls. VCR controls. I want to hit play. I want to pause it. I want to rewind to the beginning. I want to go forward a frame. I want to go to the next keyframe. Or go to the end. I want to come down here and adjust my overall configuration for time. In other words, how many frames am I going to have? My start frame is 0. My end frame is 100 by default. Perhaps I want to deal with a 300 frame animation. Am I rendering out for NTSC, PAL, film, or I can do custom as well. Basically, this is going to mean how many frames are in a second.
It's great, too, that they don't assume that you know all that stuff off the top of your head, too. You can just click the radio button for whatever you're rendering out to.
You got it. And then, of course, we've got time display, how we're going to play back in our viewports when we hit play. We're going to be at regular speed, half speed, double speed. Do we want to play forward, reverse? There's just so many different things down here. When we come down, the animation stuff, key steps, blah, blah, blah. We'll be getting to these things a little bit later on as we go through these VTMs.
Right, and like so many other things in Max, it looks intimidating when you first open the window, but if you stop and actually read what it's offering you, you'll find it's really not that bad.
That's right. So let's go ahead and jump out of this. By the way, I can also get to that just by simply coming down here and right-clicking anywhere in this. Brings it up as well.
Oh, very nice.
Or you can just hit the icon. So from animation controls, or playback controls, we'll move right over to the animation keying controls, which is this area right here. So when you start dealing with keyframing objects when working with animation. We'll be getting to all that a little bit later on. Moving on from there, in this area right here is our coordinate display area. We can deal with absolute and relative, depending on, right now this is an absolute mode, so I have a particular object. If I come in here to move, you can see that it's at negative 55 in X, negative 10 in Y, and 0 in Z. If I come in here and start moving it up, well, now it's no longer at 0 in Z because we have moved it up off the grid.
Very cool.
So you can come in here and you can manipulate these guys, type in precise numbers by hand, which is really cool. And if you needed to, we can take it from absolute mode over to relative mode, which basically means if I was to come in here and say, type something in, such as 5 and hit enter, it's going to add 5 more to where it's at. Hence,
and then it resets back to 0, too. It's actually getting ready for the next incremental motion.
You got it. Okay, so from there, so it's absolute and relative, we can also lock objects as well.
Actually, one quick thing.
Yes.
Just the coolest thing about those spinners is that you can right-click
Tink,
that
tink.
spinner.
Tink, tink.
I love that.
Tink, tink. You can right-click on any spinner, anywhere throughout 3ds Max. That's absolutely right, Zach. Very cool. And then moving right along. So we can lock selections, and if a selection is locked, I cannot come over here. You'll see right now that my move tool is still active, but I cannot come back here and select another object from behind.
And just kind of a tip out there, you can do that automatically by hitting the space bar. So if while you're working you accidentally hit the space bar and you can't select anything else, just kind of peek down there at the bottom of your screen and make sure you haven't locked it.
Just make sure the lock's not on. Very good. And now we've got our prompt line and status bar down here that's just, prompting you. We can click and drag and select objects and giving you feedback, etc., etc. And then finally over here to the side, We have got our MaxScript mini listener. We'll be getting into that a little bit later. Yeah, you can also drag this back out of the way here. So because we're running at a lower resolution, I'm just keeping this over so that we can see things that are going on. We'll be talking about these perhaps a little bit later on in time. And this brings us up to just two final things that I want to talk about, and that is coming up here to the track bar area, which is this section right here. When we start dealing with animation, it becomes really important because we can actually start seeing our keyframes and all. And then finally, right up here, we've got what is called the time slider, where we can see what frame we're actually working on. You know, if I came in here and simply turned auto key on, moved over here to frame 20, and then moved this object over, you'll see down here on my little track bar, I've got 2 keyframes put down, and I now also have animation in place. If I come over here to frame 10 and perhaps move this object up, now you can see I've got this little arcing motion going on.
Now you're getting fancy.
Okay, yeah. We don't want to get too fancy because the idea of this lesson was to just simply provide you with a quick breakdown of the 3ds Max user interface, and that is exactly what we just did.
Yep.
So, in quick recap, basically what we've got is large viewports. It's our windows into the world.
Yes.
Main menu bar across the top gives you access to just about everything that you can find throughout 3ds Max, but through menus.
Oh, wait, I know the next one. That's the main toolbar.
Main toolbar,
oh, yeah.
which in looking at this, I do have one thing that a beginner would probably not be aware of. So we can go ahead and throw a couple other things in here that's nice. And that is, you see these little triangles down in the corner of some of these buttons right here?
Oh, yeah.
These are what are called flyouts, meaning that if I click and hold with the mouse button, I get a flyout, and I can come down and select between various options. So these buttons actually contain multiple buttons, if you will.
Very organized.
And another thing, as we continue digging our way around, so leaving the main toolbar, which is going to contain a lot of things you're going to do just while you're working with a scene, is the command panel. I want to go ahead and talk about rollouts. These are rollouts. Rollouts provide a way to just kind of keep things nice and organized as you're working, because as we continue digging through 3ds Max, if I was to come over here and do what they call just basically collapsing my stack, we'll convert this to an editable poly. Suddenly, look at this, I'm using the little magical hand again, as Zach said, is available in various places. Or I can use the little scroll bar over here as well. Look at all the different things we've got. There's just so many.
Oh,
and
yeah.
Some of them by default come collapsed, as you see here. Okay, so we can expand those, we can collapse them just to help you out. You can also move your mouse over to the left-hand side of the command panel, and we can increase the size as well. So now it's going to just lay those things out over here. And we can also click and drag these things around to reorganize them if we'd like.
And for those of you who just got scared, we're going to cover everything in that menu in future lessons.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, since this is a reshoot, we can already say we've actually done that particular lesson, and we do cover, I think, every single button in checkbox.
I remember that lesson.
Yeah. What is that? Issue number 3, I think.
I think.
So we'll go ahead and simply drag it back over to close it up, but you can pull that out as far as you want. I'm not a big fan of doing it for the simple fact that we start losing a lot of real estate space. In other words, our viewports start to get a little bit smaller, and I'm not a big fan of that.
Right, and after you work in 3D for a while, you start to get stingy about how much room you got to work with.
Absolutely. So from there, our command panel, I told you, was broke up into 6 different areas, dealing with creating objects, modifying objects, working with hierarchies of objects, dealing with motion and the animation, final display, and then utilities, anything extra left over. We saw at the bottom that we can then control navigation around our viewports. We can then control our animation playbacks, in other words, playing back like a VCR. We can control our actual keyframing, recording keys, and you actually saw me use auto key a few minutes ago. Then we got over here where we could type in where the objects actually exist, or we can provide offsets, etc., with our coordinate toggles down here. And then we saw our prompt line and status bar, our MaxScript mini listener, our track bar, and our time slider. And so with that, that's going to conclude everything that I'm wanting to get across for this particular lesson. So I'd like to thank everyone.
Cool.
See ya.